The early hours of July 28, 1976 seem no different from any other summer morning in Tangshan, a growing industrial city in northeastern China. Positioned in Hebei province, Tangshan was home to approximately 1 million people, many of whom were miners, factory workers, and their families. Life hummed along with an air of routine. Few could have imagined that this ordinary day would soon become etched in history as the setting for one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. At precisely 3:42 a.m., an earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was located just 12 kilometers beneath the surface, a shallow depth that would amplify its destructive power. The region's geological makeup played a critical role in the disaster. Tangshan was situated on loose sedimentary soil, which exacerbated the seismic waves as they radiated outward. These amplified tremors turned the earth beneath the city into a rolling, heaving force of devastation. Adding to the catastrophe, Tangshan's urban development was not prepared for such a seismic event. The city lacked earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and many of its buildings were constructed from unreinforced masonry and other substandard materials. This left them vulnerable to collapse under the earthquake's immense force. When the quake struck, entire city blocks were razed in seconds, leaving little standing in its wake. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. Entire families were buried beneath rubble as buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets buckled, bridges snapped, and water mains ruptured, flooding parts of the city and making rescue efforts even more challenging. The ground itself became a hazard as fissures opened up, swallowing anything or anyone in their path. Communication lines were severed, isolating Tangshan from the outside world and delaying the flow of critical information about the scale of the disaster. The timing of the earthquake added to the tragedy. Striking while most residents were asleep in their homes, the death toll skyrocketed as people were caught completely off guard. Survivors later recounted how they were jolted awake by violent shaking, only to be engulfed by collapsing walls and falling debris. Darkness, chaos, and confusion overwhelmed the city as cries for help echoed into the night. Despite its seismic significance, there were no foreshocks to serve as a warning. While some animals reportedly exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before the quake, such as dogs barking incessantly and livestock acting erratically, these signs were not enough to prompt human action. This absence of clear warning further underscores the unexpected nature of the disaster. In the hours following the quake, Tangshan's true plight remained hidden from the world. Limited communication and China's tightly controlled media meant that the full scale of the disaster would not emerge immediately. For now, Tangshan's residents were left to grapple with the immense destruction and loss, unaided and largely unnoticed by the outside world. This marked the beginning of a disaster whose ripple effects would extend far beyond its epicenter, reshaping disaster response, preparedness, and urban planning in China and beyond. As the clock struck 3:42 in the early hours of late July, the peaceful city of Tangshan, still shrouded in the stillness of night, was torn apart by a seismic upheaval unlike anything its residents had experienced. The earthquake's force was swift, brutal, and uncompromising, generating seismic waves that spread destruction across a staggering area of over 3,000 square kilometers. The ground heaved violently, transforming solid earth into a liquid-like phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, a catastrophic process that caused buildings to tilt, sink, or collapse entirely. While the epicenter was located within Tangshan, the earthquake's effects radiated far beyond the city. Surrounding towns and rural areas were hit hard, with entire communities flattened in mere seconds. Structures ranging from modest village homes to industrial facilities crumbled under their relentless vibrations. The region's coal mines, a vital part of Tangshan's economy, were particularly devastated, trapping hundreds of workers underground. For those miners, survival became a race against time as tunnels caved in, cutting off both air and escape routes. The damage extended to critical infrastructure, further compounding the chaos. Railways were twisted into grotesque shapes, severing vital transportation links. Power plants were rendered inoperable, plunging the area into darkness, while water pipelines shattered, leaving survivors without clean water. Bridges that once connected the city to nearby regions were reduced to piles of twisted steel and concrete, isolating Tangshan further from external aid. One of the earthquake's most haunting aspects was its sheer speed. Experts later estimated that the most intense shaking lasted less than 15 seconds, yet the destruction it wrought was monumental. This brevity meant that those who might have reacted to the tremors had virtually no time to escape. Survivors described the moments of impact as akin to an apocalyptic storm, walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and the air filling with a deafening roar as the ground moved beneath them. Adding to the horror, the earthquake struck during a heat wave, compounding the physical and emotional toll on survivors. Temperatures soared, and without shelter, clean water, or medical supplies, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Many were forced to endure the blistering heat while searching for loved ones or trying to rescue neighbors trapped beneath the rubble. The sweltering conditions also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, posing significant health risks and further traumatizing those who remained. Another tragic element of the disaster was the widespread loss of life among children. Many schools in Tangshan were not built to withstand even minor earthquakes, let alone a seismic event of this magnitude. As a result, countless young lives were lost when classrooms collapsed, burying students and teachers under tons of debris. These heart-wrenching scenes left an indelible scar on the community and would later fuel demands for stricter building regulations and earthquake preparedness. Meanwhile, survivors faced a terrifying landscape of ruin. Fires broke out across the city as ruptured gas lines ignited, creating an additional hazard for those navigating the wreckage. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the cries of those in pain or mourning their losses. Every moment was a test of resilience as individuals banded together to lift debris, carry the injured to makeshift medical stations, or dig with their bare hands in desperate attempts to find loved ones. Despite the enormity of the disaster, Tangshan's plight initially remained largely unknown to the outside world. The destruction of communication lines and the isolated nature of the region created a chilling silence that left even neighboring cities unaware of the unfolding tragedy. For the people of Tangshan, this isolation deepened their sense of abandonment, as it became clear that immediate help was not on the way. These early hours marked a critical juncture in what would become one of history's most significant natural disasters, setting the stage for an unparalleled story of survival, loss, and resilience. The devastation caused by the Tangshan earthquake unfolded on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, creating a vast expanse of destruction where homes, schools, factories, and hospitals once stood. Over 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed, leaving the majority of Tangshan's population without shelter. The widespread collapse of infrastructure compounded the chaos, forcing survivors to confront a harsh and unforgiving reality in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. The industrial heart of Tangshan, once a bustling hub of economic activity, was obliterated. Factories that powered the region's economy lay in ruins, and heavy machinery was scattered like toys across the landscape. Among the hardest hit were coal mines, which suffered catastrophic collapses, burying hundreds of workers deep underground. These miners faced a desperate battle for survival, contending with toxic gas, flooding, and the ever-present risk of further cave-ins. Hospitals and medical facilities critical for treating the injured were not spared. Most were destroyed, and those that remained operational were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift medical centers sprang up in open fields and among the debris, staffed by a few doctors and nurses who survived. Supplies of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages were woefully inadequate, forcing medical workers to improvise treatments and prioritize the most critical cases. With the injured numbering in the tens of thousands, triage became a grim and inescapable task. Amidst the destruction, survivors faced immense challenges in securing basic necessities. Access to clean water was nearly non-existent, as pipelines had been shattered and wells contaminated. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, leaving many to scavenge through the wreckage or share meager rations. The summer heat exacerbated these hardships, with temperatures soaring above 37 degrees Celsius, further threatening the health of those already weakened by injury or exhaustion. Survivors banded together in an incredible display of human resilience and solidarity. Men, women, and even children took part in rescue efforts, using bare hands and simple tools to dig through the rubble. Makeshift teams formed spontaneously, driven by the shared hope of finding loved ones alive beneath the debris. Tragically, the majority of those trapped could not be saved, as the sheer scale of destruction and the lack of heavy rescue equipment hindered these efforts. The earthquake also inflicted devastating emotional wounds. Families were torn apart as countless lives were lost in an instant. The grief of those who survived was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the fate of their loved ones. Makeshift memorials began appearing within days, with survivors placing flowers, candles, and personal mementos near the sites where friends and family had perished. Adding to the catastrophe, aftershocks continued to terrorize the region. These tremors, some significant in their own right, caused further collapses and heightened the fear of those already traumatized by the initial quake. For the residents of Tangshan, the ground beneath them seemed permanently unstable, and each aftershock was a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. As word of the disaster began to spread beyond Tangshan, nearby towns and villages grappled with their own losses. The destruction was not confined to the city alone. Smaller communities were equally devastated, though their struggles often went unnoticed in the shadow of Tangshan's catastrophe. These areas faced similar shortages of water, food, and medical supplies, further straining the limited resources available for relief efforts. In these early days, survival was a test of willpower and ingenuity. The residents of Tangshan and its surrounding areas displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, setting the stage for a long and arduous recovery. The city's ruins bore silent witness to the resilience of its people, even as the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. In the months and years following the Tangshan earthquake, the true extent of the disaster became a defining moment in modern Chinese history. The challenges of rebuilding a shattered city, addressing the emotional scars of survivors, and honoring the memory of those lost created a legacy that would shape Tangshan and its people for generations. The Chinese government launched an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Within days of the disaster, engineers and construction crews from across the country descended on Tangshan. Entire neighborhoods were cleared of debris, and temporary shelters were erected to house the displaced population. Despite limited resources, the reconstruction process reflected a commitment to rebuilding not just the city's infrastructure, but its spirit. By the early 1980s, Tangshan began to transform into a symbol of resilience and recovery, with new buildings rising in place of the ruins. Public health initiatives also became a cornerstone of the post-disaster response. The widespread destruction of hospitals and sanitation facilities had led to fears of disease outbreaks. Medical teams worked tirelessly to vaccinate survivors and improve living conditions in temporary camps. Over time, Tangshan emerged as a model for public health planning in the aftermath of disasters, influencing emergency response strategies across China. For the survivors, the earthquake left deep psychological wounds. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the disaster. Community support networks played a crucial role in helping individuals process their grief. Over the years, storytelling, art, and cultural events became powerful tools for healing, allowing survivors to share their experiences and honor the memories of loved ones. The Tangshan earthquake also catalyzed advancements in earthquake research and preparedness. The scale of destruction highlighted the need for improved building standards and stricter enforcement of construction codes. By the 1990s, Tangshan's new structures were built to withstand earthquakes, reflecting lessons learned from the tragedy. The disaster also spurred the development of early warning systems and a nationwide focus on earthquake education, which have since saved countless lives. Globally, the Tangshan earthquake drew attention to the importance of international solidarity in the face of natural disasters. Although China largely relied on internal resources, offers of aid from other countries marked a significant shift in global disaster response dynamics. The tragedy underscored the shared vulnerability of humanity and the need for collective action to mitigate the impact of such events. In Tangshan today, memorials stand as a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of those who survived. The Tangshan Earthquake Memorial Park, completed in the late 20th century, is a place of reflection and remembrance. Its design incorporates remnants of destroyed buildings and poignant sculptures, ensuring that the memory of the disaster remains alive for future generations. The earthquake also left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It inspired literature, film, and academic studies, shaping the way disasters are understood and discussed. The stories of survival and courage from Tangshan resonate far beyond the city, serving as a reminder of humanity's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. As the decades have passed, Tangshan has risen from its darkest moment to become a thriving city once again. Its recovery is a testament to the resilience of its people, the power of community, and the lessons learned from one of history's most devastating natural disasters. The legacy of the Tangshan earthquake is not merely one of destruction, but also of rebuilding, healing, and hope for a better future. On October 17, 1989, the San Francisco Bay Area was rocked by one of the most destructive earthquakes in American history. It was an event that would forever change the way people thought about the power of nature and its ability to strike without warning. The earthquake, known as the Loma Prieta earthquake, had a magnitude of 6.9 and caused over $6 billion in damage. It left a deep scar on the region and triggered a wave of changes that would shape the future of earthquake preparedness and urban infrastructure in the United States. The Loma Prieta earthquake struck in the late afternoon at precisely 5:35 p.m. Just as many people were heading home from work. It was during this rush hour when the earthquake's timing would prove to be especially devastating. The shaking lasted only 15 seconds, but during that brief period, it felt as though the ground itself was being torn apart. Buildings swayed and buckled, roads cracked and split, and chaos erupted all over the Bay Area. The epicenter was located in the Santa Cruz Mountains, near the small town of Loma Prieta, which is where the earthquake got its name. Though the epicenter was in a more rural area, the impact was felt far and wide. The city of San Francisco, along with surrounding towns like Oakland, Berkeley, and Santa Cruz, experienced some of the most severe damage. The earthquake was part of the larger complex system of faults beneath California, known as the San Andreas Fault Zone. The tremor was not just a violent shake, it was a reminder of the region's vulnerability to seismic activity. And despite the fact that California is known for its earthquakes, nothing could have prepared the Bay Area for the immense destruction that was about to unfold. In San Francisco, buildings that had withstood decades of earthquakes now buckled under the force of the tremor. Historic structures crumbled, and in some places, entire neighborhoods were wiped out in a matter of seconds. It wasn't just the buildings that suffered, the city's infrastructure was shattered. Power lines were downed, gas mains ruptured, and water systems were compromised. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming as people rushed to find safety, unaware of what was coming next. But the earthquake wasn't just a terrifying natural disaster, it was also a wake-up call. Many had known that the Bay Area was due for a major earthquake, but few could have predicted the sheer force and speed with which it hit. The suddenness of the event left emergency responders scrambling, and the vast scale of the destruction presented immense challenges for rescuers. For many, the reality of the earthquake's devastation didn't truly hit until hours later, when the extent of the damage became clear. As the dust began to settle and the ground stopped shaking, the people of the Bay Area were left to assess the damage. Buildings were reduced to rubble, roads were impassable, and communities were isolated. In some areas, the ground itself had shifted so violently that entire streets were cracked and lifted from their foundations. It was a stark reminder of the raw, uncontrollable force of nature. In the coming days, the toll of the Loma Prieta earthquake would be made clear. Over 60 people were confirmed dead, with thousands more injured. The destruction would continue to disrupt the region for weeks, if not months, as recovery and rebuilding efforts took hold. The emotional impact of the earthquake was profound, but so too was its effect on the physical landscape. San Francisco, Oakland, and other affected areas would face the difficult challenge of not just rebuilding, but learning from the experience. They would come to understand, more than ever before, how vital it was to be prepared for the unexpected. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a tragic event, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in earthquake awareness. It set in motion a series of changes in construction standards, emergency response protocols, and public safety campaigns. It became clear that no region, no matter how prepared, could ever truly be ready for the next big one. But with every lesson learned, the hope was that the devastation could be minimized and future generations could face earthquakes with a better understanding of what to do when disaster strikes. What made the Loma Prieta earthquake so memorable wasn't just its strength or the damage it caused, but how it changed the way we think about natural disasters. It would become one of the most important events in California's history, leaving an indelible mark on the people who lived through it and the generations that followed. As the tremors of the Loma Prieta earthquake faded away, a quiet panic began to set in. What had just happened? What was the extent of the damage? The chaos was overwhelming. In the moments following the earthquake, San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area were thrown into disarray. People, disoriented and afraid, scrambled to make sense of the destruction around them. The sound of sirens filled the air as emergency responders rushed to help, but the scale of the disaster soon became evident. Rescue teams would soon find themselves working under nearly impossible conditions. The epicenter of the earthquake was located in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but the damage was felt as far away as Sacramento and parts of Southern California. The earthquake lasted only 15 seconds, but in those moments it caused immense destruction. It was a reminder of how quickly things can change and how unprepared even the most modern, well-established cities can be for the wrath of nature. The city of San Francisco, already a bustling metropolis, was now in a state of emergency. Major thoroughfares like the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge were affected. With transportation lines cut off, getting supplies into the city was impossible. The Bay Bridge, which connects San Francisco with Oakland, was severely damaged. The upper deck of the bridge collapsed onto the lower deck, creating a deadly mess of twisted steel and concrete. The bridge's collapse made it impossible for people to move between the cities, cutting off essential routes for rescue teams, emergency supplies, and medical aid. People who were stranded on the bridge had no choice but to wait for help. In neighborhoods close to the epicenter, the destruction was far worse. Buildings were reduced to rubble, leaving residents trapped under tons of debris. Entire city blocks were destroyed in a matter of seconds. Roads that were once smooth and easily navigable were cracked and displaced, making it nearly impossible for emergency vehicles to reach those in need of help. The damage wasn't just confined to buildings, it was the entire city's infrastructure that had taken a hit. Power outages blanketed the city, leaving thousands without electricity, which was crucial for medical facilities, hospitals, and rescue teams trying to save lives. Santa Cruz, a city about 30 miles south of the epicenter, was hit especially hard. The downtown area, which had been full of history and character, was now reduced to piles of rubble. One of the most iconic buildings in the city, the Pacific Garden Mall, had been partially destroyed. What had once been a bustling shopping center was now an eerie ghost of its former self, with walls collapsed and debris scattered across the streets. Local residents and business owners were now faced with the daunting task of figuring out how to survive in an area where nothing was safe. As night began to fall, the full extent of the damage became clearer. In addition to the collapsed buildings and broken bridges, fires broke out across the city. Gas lines that had been ruptured during the quake ignited, spreading flames quickly across neighborhoods. Firefighters, already overwhelmed with rescue operations, now had to contend with fires that seemed to multiply by the hour. The thick smoke from the flames made it difficult to see and breathe, creating even more chaos in an already chaotic situation. Meanwhile, search and rescue operations were launched in full force. Emergency crews worked around the clock, sifting through the debris in search of survivors. Time was of the essence, as each passing hour brought the risk of further casualties. Dogs were brought in to help locate people trapped under the wreckage. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, but the reality was grim. It was unclear how many people had been caught in the collapse of buildings, and the fear of aftershocks only added to the anxiety. As survivors were pulled from the wreckage, they were rushed to the few hospitals that were still operational. Medical staff worked tirelessly under intense pressure to treat the injured, but the conditions in the hospitals were far from ideal. Many were working without power or proper medical equipment, which further complicated their efforts. Across the Bay Area, stories of heroism began to emerge. Ordinary citizens stepped up in extraordinary ways, helping their neighbors and strangers alike. People who had never considered themselves heroes suddenly found themselves involved in life-saving efforts. These acts of kindness and bravery became a symbol of hope during the early days of the aftermath. For those who survived, the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake was more than just physical damage. It was emotional trauma as well. Many had lost homes, businesses, and loved ones. The city of San Francisco, which had long prided itself on its resilience and strength, now had to confront its vulnerabilities. The destruction had not just fractured buildings, but also fractured the very sense of safety and security that people once took for granted. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that recovery would take years. The extent of the damage required a complete rebuilding of the city's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and buildings. Emergency response teams worked day and night, but the task ahead seemed daunting. What made this disaster so unique was not only its destruction, but the way in which the people of the Bay Area would pull together to recover. Through the rubble and the smoke, there was a collective determination to rebuild, to survive, and to come back stronger than ever. The Loma Prieta earthquake may have left an indelible mark on the region, but it also ignited a fierce spirit of resilience that would carry the Bay Area through the hardest days of its recovery. The Loma Prieta earthquake on October 17, 1989, left an indelible mark on San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area. While the initial shock was devastating, The ripple effects continued to unfold in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. What many did not realize at first was just how far-reaching the effects of this earthquake would be, not only on the physical landscape, but also on the social and economic fabric of the region. San Francisco, a city already known for its beauty, culture, and innovation, suddenly found itself grappling with the destruction of key infrastructure. The collapse of the Bay Bridge, a vital connection between San Francisco and Oakland, was a particularly crushing blow. The earthquake had caused the upper deck of the bridge to fall onto the lower deck, leaving a twisted mess of metal and concrete. Commuters who would typically rely on this busy route now found themselves stranded on either side of the bay. With this vital connection severed, the city was left to face a logistical nightmare, further exacerbating the struggle of getting emergency supplies and medical help into the area. Beyond the Bay Bridge, other major roadways and bridges suffered significant damage. The Oakland-San Francisco commute, which usually took a mere 15 to 20 minutes, now seemed impossible. The destruction of key transportation routes created a domino effect, further delaying the arrival of rescuers and supplies. The very heart of the Bay Area's transportation system had been disrupted, and its rebuilding would take years. As for the city itself, many of San Francisco's neighborhoods were unrecognizable after the quake. The devastation extended far beyond the immediate epicenter in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Downtown San Francisco, known for its iconic architecture and high-rise buildings, was not immune to the earthquake's destruction. Roads were cracked and uneven, forcing vehicles to maneuver slowly and carefully. Pedestrians walked cautiously as they navigated through the debris and wreckage that littered the streets. In the aftermath, large sections of the city were left without electricity, water, or gas, creating not only a logistical challenge, but also a public health crisis. Without power, hospitals were running on backup generators, and many businesses were forced to close, further exacerbating the city's economic hardships. The loss of life was tragic, with hundreds of residents injured or killed in the wake of the earthquake. However, the community's response was equally remarkable. In the days following the disaster, neighbors, friends, and complete strangers came together to support one another. Local businesses, many of which had been destroyed or severely damaged, began to reopen in makeshift locations to provide food, water, and medical supplies. Many residents joined forces to search for survivors in the rubble, risking their own safety to help others. It was this sense of unity in the face of crisis that helped the Bay Area slowly begin to heal. In addition to the immediate physical damage, the earthquake brought the issue of building codes and safety to the forefront. Many of the buildings that collapsed were older structures that hadn't been retrofitted to withstand a major seismic event. The Bay Area was no stranger to earthquakes, but the Loma Prieta quake served as a wake-up call. It became clear that stricter building codes were necessary to ensure that future earthquakes wouldn't lead to the same kind of destruction. This realization would lead to significant changes in construction standards and the way cities prepared for and responded to natural disasters. The collapse of historic buildings and neighborhoods left scars on the city's landscape, but it also brought about a renewed sense of purpose. San Francisco began to reimagine itself, not just as a city recovering from a disaster, but as a community committed to rebuilding stronger, more resilient infrastructure. The focus shifted to ensuring that future disasters would be met with preparation and resources capable of minimizing destruction. While San Francisco was undoubtedly impacted, the surrounding areas also faced their own set of challenges. Cities such as Oakland, San Jose, and Santa Cruz found themselves dealing with similar devastation, though on varying scales. Santa Cruz, located closer to the epicenter, had a particularly tough time recovering. The Pacific Garden Mall, one of the city's most beloved landmarks, was completely destroyed and entire blocks were left in ruins. Santa Cruz, a city that prided itself on its charming beachside atmosphere, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding from the ground up. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the emotional toll of the earthquake was just as significant as the physical damage. Residents were not only coping with the loss of homes and businesses, but they also struggled with the mental and emotional consequences of the disaster. The trauma of the event weighed heavily on the minds of those who had lived through it, particularly those who had lost loved ones, homes, or their livelihood. The sense of grief was compounded by the overwhelming task of rebuilding. Yet, despite these heavy burdens, a sense of hope emerged from the devastation. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a tragic reminder of the power of nature and the vulnerability of human infrastructure, but it also demonstrated the strength of the community and its ability to adapt and rebuild in the face of disaster. In the months and years following the earthquake, the Bay Area would become a symbol of resilience, showing the world what it meant to overcome devastation and emerge stronger. In the end, the Loma Prieta earthquake would have lasting consequences not only in the physical landscape of the Bay Area, but also in the ways that communities and governments approached disaster preparedness. It forced a reassessment of the region's infrastructure, encouraged new legislation on building safety, and provided a clear message to the world about the power of earthquakes. Though the scars of the earthquake would never fully fade, the legacy of recovery and rebuilding would shape the Bay Area for generations to come. The Loma Prieta earthquake of October 17, 1989, left its mark not only on the Bay Area, but on the entire nation. The immediate chaos, destruction, and loss of life were staggering, but the long-term effects of the earthquake were felt for years. As the dust settled and rescue operations concluded, the task of rebuilding began. However, this would prove to be an immensely challenging and costly endeavor, with lessons learned that would forever change how cities and communities approached disaster preparedness and recovery. In the months following the earthquake, the primary concern was the restoration of critical infrastructure. The collapse of the Bay Bridge had made it clear just how vulnerable cities were when faced with a large-scale disaster. Reconstruction efforts for this vital piece of infrastructure took several years, with the bridge eventually reopening in 2003. However, the rebuilding process involved much more than simply repairing what was broken. The Loma Prieta earthquake forced the Bay Area to rethink its entire approach to infrastructure and building safety. This earthquake served as a catalyst for widespread changes in building codes and seismic safety standards. Cities across California and the United States looked to the Bay Area as a case study for what could happen when buildings and bridges were not built with enough resilience to withstand a powerful quake. Following the disaster, construction codes were updated to make sure new buildings would be better equipped to handle seismic activity. Retrofitting older structures to meet these new standards became a priority. This shift in construction practices reflected a broader, more cautious approach to urban planning that took into account the inevitable risk posed by earthquakes in the region. Additionally, the event highlighted the importance of emergency preparedness and response systems. While the emergency responders did a remarkable job in the immediate aftermath, the massive scale of the destruction made it clear that resources needed to be better coordinated. A more unified approach to disaster relief was needed, with more advanced technology, systems, and protocols to ensure quicker responses in future emergencies. Local, state, and federal agencies would work together in the years that followed to strengthen these systems, and they implemented various programs to provide better support in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Perhaps one of the most significant changes following the Loma Prieta earthquake was the advancement in public awareness about the risks of earthquakes. Prior to the event, many people in California, particularly those in the Bay Area, had grown complacent, assuming that an earthquake of such magnitude was unlikely. The Loma Prieta earthquake shattered this false sense of security and became a stark reminder of the region's vulnerability. Educational campaigns were launched to inform the public about earthquake preparedness, emphasizing the importance of having emergency kits, knowing evacuation routes, and ensuring homes and buildings were as earthquake-resistant as possible. Another long-term consequence was the economic impact on the Bay Area. Many businesses, particularly small local establishments, faced devastating losses. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt, and the cost of doing so was astronomical. The overall economic damage caused by the earthquake was estimated at over $6 billion, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in U.S. history. While insurance helped cover some of the costs, many residents and business owners were left struggling to rebuild their lives from the ground up. This financial burden would take years to overcome, and in some cases, families and businesses would never fully recover. For some residents, the emotional toll was just as severe. The trauma of surviving such a destructive event left deep psychological scars. Many of those who experienced the earthquake firsthand struggled with feelings of anxiety, loss, and grief in the months that followed. The mental health effects were widespread, particularly among those who lost family members, homes, or businesses. Local organizations worked tirelessly to provide counseling and support, but it was clear that the emotional recovery would take just as long, if not longer, than the physical rebuilding. Despite the immense challenges, the response to the Loma Prieta earthquake also demonstrated the strength and resilience of the Bay Area's communities. Volunteers from across the nation came to offer their help, with people from all walks of life working together to support those affected. Communities that had been torn apart by the earthquake slowly began to rebuild, and residents took pride in their ability to persevere. The earthquake, while devastating, became a symbol of the human spirit's ability to recover in the face of catastrophe. As time passed, the Loma Prieta earthquake would also have an impact on how future natural disasters were handled. The lessons learned from this event that would influence how cities across the world prepared for earthquakes and other natural disasters. Emergency management strategies were refined, and a greater emphasis was placed on building stronger, more resilient communities. The final legacy of the Loma Prieta earthquake is perhaps best encapsulated by the changes it brought to California's approach to disaster response and infrastructure development. The disaster was a wake-up call that pushed the region and the world to rethink how we build, how we prepare, and how we recover from natural disasters. Today, thanks to the lessons learned during that fateful October day, the Bay Area is stronger, more resilient, and better equipped to face the next inevitable earthquake. The Loma Prieta earthquake remains a defining moment in American history, not just for the destruction it caused, but for the lessons it taught us about the fragility of human-made structures and the power of nature. While the scars of the disaster still remain, they serve as a constant reminder of our vulnerability, our strength, and our ability to rebuild in the face of adversity. The resilience of the Bay Area and the nation as a whole was tested in the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the lessons learned continue to shape how we prepare for the challenges of tomorrow. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, also known as the Great Alaskan Earthquake or the Good Friday Earthquake, was a devastating natural disaster that struck Alaska on the evening of March 27, 1964. The quake occurred at 5:36 p.m. Alaska Standard Time and is remembered as one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. With a magnitude of 9.2, it remains the largest earthquake in North American history and the second largest globally since modern seismography began in 1900. This disaster took place in the south-central region of Alaska, affecting numerous cities and towns, including Anchorage, Seward, and Valdez. It lasted for nearly 4.5 minutes, but the destruction that followed was catastrophic. Massive ground fissures, landslides, and collapsing buildings wreaked havoc on the area, while a series of deadly tsunamis triggered by the quake caused further devastation along the Alaskan coastline and beyond. The backstory to this earthquake involves the slow but immense pressure that had built up between two tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. Over centuries, these plates had been pushing against each other, creating enormous stress deep beneath the Earth's surface. When that pressure finally released on that Good Friday in 1964, the impact was felt far and wide, not only in Alaska, but also in places as far away as Japan and California. In the days leading up to the quake, there were no clear signs or warnings. The people of Alaska, much like the rest of the world, were caught completely off guard when the Earth began to shake violently that evening. The Alaska earthquake of 1964 was caused by the movement of the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. Alaska sits on the boundary between these two plates, which are part of the larger Pacific Ring of Fire, an area known for frequent seismic activity. For centuries, the Pacific Plate had been slowly pushing beneath the North American Plate in a process called subduction. As the plates moved, immense pressure built up where they met, and by March of 1964, that pressure was at its breaking point. On March 27th, the stress that had been accumulating beneath the Earth's crust was suddenly released, leading to the massive 9.2 magnitude earthquake. The rupture occurred about 15 miles below the surface, and it stretched across an area roughly 500 miles long and 125 miles wide. The force of the earthquake caused the ground to shake violently, and in some places, the land rose or sank by as much as 38 feet. In the first few moments of the quake, the ground motion was so intense that it made standing or walking impossible for anyone caught outside. Buildings swayed, roads cracked, and entire neighborhoods shifted as the ground beneath them heaved. As the earthquake continued for more than 4 minutes, it became clear that this was no ordinary tremor. People across Alaska were experiencing a catastrophe unlike anything they had ever seen. While the shaking was terrifying, the real damage was still to come. In the hours following the earthquake, massive aftershocks, some of them as strong as magnitude 7, continued to rattle the region, deepening the destruction. The impact of the 1964 Alaska earthquake on cities and towns was nothing short of catastrophic. Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, was hit particularly hard. Buildings that had once stood tall crumbled under the force of the earthquake. Entire sections of the city were leveled as the ground split open and buckled. In some neighborhoods, houses were ripped apart as the land beneath them shifted dramatically. The city's downtown area saw significant damage, with large structures collapsing and streets becoming impassable due to deep cracks and fissures. Seward, a small town located near the epicenter, experienced unimaginable devastation. The earthquake triggered landslides that tore through the town, and within minutes, fires broke out as fuel tanks exploded. But the worst was yet to come. Minutes after the earthquake, a massive tsunami hit the town, washing away buildings, docks, and everything in its path. The water surged through the streets, dragging debris and leaving a trail of destruction. In Valdez, another coastal town, the earthquake's impact was equally devastating. A section of the waterfront slid into the sea, taking homes and buildings with it. Valdez also faced a terrifying tsunami that swept away parts of the town. Waves as high as 200 feet hit the coastline, and residents who had survived the initial earthquake now faced the deadly power of the sea. Kodiak, located further south, also suffered from the earthquake's impact. The powerful shaking caused severe damage to the town, and within minutes, the tsunami hit, destroying homes and businesses. The water rose rapidly, submerging large areas and leaving destruction in its wake. The port, a vital part of the town's economy, was wiped out as the tsunami waves obliterated docks and boats. Beyond the immediate destruction, the earthquake also caused landslides and avalanches across Alaska's rugged terrain. Whole mountainsides collapsed, and in remote areas, entire forests were flattened. The impact was felt far beyond Alaska, with shaking reported as far away as California and Japan. The aftermath of the 1964 Alaska earthquake was as challenging as the disaster itself. The destruction was widespread, leaving thousands of people without homes, businesses in ruins, and entire communities cut off from the outside world. In Anchorage, nearly every major building had been damaged or destroyed, leaving residents to grapple with the loss of their homes, schools, and workplaces. Temporary shelters were quickly set up to house those who had been displaced, but the scale of the damage meant that recovery would take years. One of the most devastating effects of the earthquake was the destruction of infrastructure. Roads and bridges were wiped out or severely damaged, making it nearly impossible to reach some of the most affected areas. The main highway connecting Anchorage to other parts of Alaska had collapsed in many places, and in the coastal towns, the destruction of ports and harbors left communities isolated. Relief efforts were hampered by these challenges as rescuers struggled to reach those in need. The U.S. military played a crucial role in the disaster response, deploying resources to help with search and rescue operations and to deliver supplies to the hardest-hit areas. Military planes and helicopters flew over remote parts of the state, dropping food, water, and medical supplies to isolated communities. Naval ships were sent to coastal towns like Valdez and Seward, where the combination of the earthquake and the tsunami had caused near-total devastation. The psychological impact on the people of Alaska was profound. Many who had survived the earthquake were left traumatized by the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. The constant aftershocks, some of which were strong enough to cause further damage, kept the population in a state of fear and uncertainty for weeks after the initial earthquake. In total, more than 100 aftershocks were recorded in the first 24 hours alone, and they continued for months, adding to the already immense sense of unease. As the initial shock wore off, the long process of rebuilding began. Volunteers and relief organizations from across the country came to Alaska to help with the recovery efforts. Engineers and construction crews worked tirelessly to repair the infrastructure, rebuild homes, and restore vital services. But despite these efforts, the full recovery would take years, and some of the damage, particularly in coastal areas like Valdez, was so severe that entire communities had to be relocated. In the years following the 1964 Alaska earthquake, the state gradually rebuilt itself, but the scars of the disaster were long-lasting. The earthquake left an indelible mark, not just on the land, but on the people of Alaska, who had to adapt to the new reality of living in a region with such immense geological power. Buildings and infrastructure were redesigned to be more earthquake-resistant, and new safety protocols were developed to ensure that communities would be better prepared for future disasters. One of the most important changes that came out of the earthquake was a greater understanding of seismic activity, particularly in Alaska. Scientists from all over the world flocked to the state in the aftermath of the disaster, studying the effects of the earthquake and the tsunamis that followed. Their research led to important advances in the field of seismology, including the development of better monitoring systems that could provide early warnings of future quakes. This knowledge would go on to inform earthquake preparedness efforts not just in Alaska, but in other earthquake-prone regions around the world. For many of the survivors, the memories of March 27, 1964, never faded. The earthquake had taken lives, destroyed homes, and reshaped entire communities, but it also brought out the resilience and strength of the Alaskan people. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and solidarity became part of the collective memory as residents supported each other through the darkest hours and rebuilt their communities from the ground up. The earthquake also left a legacy of awareness and preparedness. Public education campaigns were launched to ensure that Alaskans knew how to respond in the event of another major quake. Regular drills and preparedness exercises became part of life in schools and workplaces across the state, ensuring that future generations would be ready if and when disaster struck again. In the end, the 1964 Alaska earthquake remains one of the most powerful natural disasters in U.S. history. It reshaped not just the physical landscape of Alaska, but also the mindset of its people, creating a legacy of resilience and preparedness. While the state has seen other disasters in the years since, none have left a mark quite like the Good Friday earthquake, a day that forever changed Alaska. The city of Messina, located on the northeastern coast of Sicily, Italy, was once a thriving metropolis known for its rich history, beautiful architecture, and vibrant culture. But on the morning of December 28, 1908, everything changed. What was once a bustling city full of life was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, forever altering its fate. Messina had long been in a region known for seismic activity. It sits on the edge of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, making it prone to earthquakes. However, despite this knowledge, the city was not prepared for what was to come. The buildings were constructed with outdated methods and materials that weren't designed to withstand the force of such a powerful earthquake. Streets were narrow, and the infrastructure was old, making the city particularly vulnerable when disaster struck. The fact that most of the population was still asleep when the earthquake hit only worsened the situation, leaving people trapped in their homes and buildings before they even had a chance to react. The earthquake itself struck with devastating force at around 5:30 in the morning. It was a massive 7.1 magnitude quake, but the destruction was made worse by the location of its epicenter just off the coast of Sicily. Not only did the earthquake shake the ground with incredible intensity, but it also triggered a massive tsunami that slammed into the coastline, adding to the devastation. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out, and the streets were filled with dust and debris. People were thrown from their beds and entire neighborhoods were destroyed in seconds. It was an event of epic proportions, but what was even more tragic was how unprepared Messina was for such a disaster. The city had no established emergency protocols, and there were no systems in place to effectively warn the public or respond to such a catastrophic event. Many of the buildings that had once stood proudly in the city center were reduced to rubble, and the few buildings that remained standing were severely damaged. Communication systems were knocked out, and emergency services were unable to respond quickly, further complicating the rescue efforts. This lack of preparedness and poor building standards were major contributing factors to the staggering loss of life. It's estimated that over 70,000 people lost their lives in the earthquake, but the number of casualties could have been even higher if not for the incredible efforts of survivors and international rescue teams. The tragedy would forever be etched into the history of Italy and the world, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of disaster preparedness and the dangers posed by seismic activity in vulnerable areas. In the following parts, we'll dive deeper into the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the struggles of the survivors, and how the earthquake left its mark on both the city of Messina and the world as a whole. But for now, it's clear that the earthquake of December 28, 1908 not only shattered buildings, but also the lives of thousands of people, forever changing the course of history. As the dust began to settle after the devastating earthquake that struck Messina on December 28, 1908, The scale of the destruction became painfully clear. The once thriving city, full of historical landmarks and elegant architecture, was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map, and the few structures that managed to survive were severely damaged. Fires raged in the chaos, adding to the already overwhelming destruction. What was once a bustling city was now a war zone. The first hours after the quake were chaotic. With the city's infrastructure in ruins, communications were nearly impossible. There were no working telephones, no power lines, and no way to quickly coordinate rescue efforts. What made the situation even worse was that the survivors were left to fend for themselves, as no immediate help arrived from local authorities. Rescue teams were unable to access the most heavily affected areas due to the rubble blocking the narrow streets of the city, making it almost impossible to reach those who were trapped beneath the collapsed buildings. People were left stranded without medical assistance, with many injured, some unable to even move. Hospitals were overwhelmed and medical supplies were running low. Surgeons and doctors were forced to operate in makeshift hospitals, often under dire conditions. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that so many of the city's emergency services were destroyed or non-functional. It was only after several hours that international aid began to arrive, but for many, it was too late. The city had been left to deal with the immediate aftermath on its own. At the same time, the tsunami that had been triggered by the earthquake caused additional chaos along the coast. The waves, which reached up to 3 meters in height, hit the city of Messina and the surrounding areas, further damaging the already fragile coastal structures and sweeping away entire buildings. The powerful waves caused more casualties, and many survivors who had initially escaped the earthquake found themselves caught in the deadly waves. The Italian government's response to the disaster was slow and uncoordinated. It wasn't until hours after the quake struck that any significant help came from the authorities, despite the growing number of people in need of aid. The lack of preparedness in the face of such a massive disaster left the survivors feeling abandoned, with frustration and anger mounting against the government for not acting sooner. Many people turned to neighboring regions and international organizations for help, hoping that outside assistance would provide the support the city so desperately needed. The impact on Messina's economy was equally devastating. With trade and commerce disrupted for weeks, businesses were forced to close their doors. The economic shockwaves rippled through the region, leaving many people unemployed and without basic necessities. The city's ports, which were once vital to its economy, were heavily damaged, making it nearly impossible to ship goods in or out of the region. In addition to the immediate physical damage, the emotional toll on the people of Messina was profound. Families had lost everything: homes, loved ones, and livelihoods. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, and those who survived were left to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The psychological trauma of the event would linger long after the physical damage had been repaired, leaving deep scars on the collective memory of the people of Messina. As the days passed and more survivors were pulled from the rubble, the world began to take notice of the disaster. International aid poured in from countries around the globe, offering financial assistance, medical supplies, and teams of rescue workers. The international community came together to help Messina, but the Italian government's delayed response left a lasting sense of bitterness among the survivors. The contrast between the swift actions of foreign aid organizations and the slow response of local authorities further highlighted the deficiencies in disaster preparedness and response at the time. While the devastation was undeniable, the people of Messina showed extraordinary resilience in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Despite the lack of immediate aid, the survivors banded together to support one another, forming makeshift communities and organizing efforts to clear the rubble and search for any remaining survivors. Their determination to rebuild their lives amid such a catastrophic event marked the beginning of a long recovery process, one that would take years and require the collective effort of not just Messina, but the entire country. Next, we'll explore the long road to recovery and the challenges that the survivors faced as they struggled to rebuild their city. As the days turned into weeks after the December 28th, 1908 earthquake, the people of Messina faced the daunting task of picking up the pieces of their shattered city. The scale of the destruction was so vast that rebuilding seemed almost impossible. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened, and the once thriving cityscape was now a scene of chaos and ruin. The survivors, however, showed a remarkable sense of determination. They began to organize and take action, working together to clear the rubble and rebuild their lives from scratch. In the aftermath, it was clear that Messina would need more than just physical reconstruction. it would require a complete overhaul of its infrastructure. The lack of strong building codes, which had allowed for the widespread destruction, became glaringly evident. Many of the structures that had collapsed during the earthquake were old and built without proper consideration for seismic activity. In fact, Italy had not yet developed modern, earthquake-resistant building standards, and the devastation of 1908 underscored the urgent need for change. The rebuilding process was slow and grueling. Resources were scarce, and the city's economy had been severely crippled by the disaster. Many people who had lost their homes were left without jobs, and the once bustling port of Messina was no longer functioning. Yet despite these challenges, the people of the city remained resilient. They worked together to clear the streets and rebuild their homes. Starting with makeshift shelters for those who had lost everything, one of the first priorities was to rebuild the infrastructure that had been so crucial to the city's functioning before the earthquake. Roads and bridges needed to be repaired, and the vital railway system which connected Messina to other parts of Italy had been disrupted. Rebuilding the port, which had been one of the city's main economic engines, was another top priority. Without it, Messina would struggle to recover economically. The Italian government, despite its initial slow response, began to take action in the months following the disaster. It provided some financial assistance and began to work with international organizations to help with the recovery process. However, many people still felt that the government's efforts were insufficient and that more could have been done in the immediate aftermath. The international community also continued to provide aid, and countries around the world sent resources, money, and workers to assist with the recovery. As the months passed, the survivors began to slowly rebuild their homes and businesses, but the city's landscape had been permanently altered. The once beautiful historical buildings that lined the streets of Messina were gone, and many of the city's landmarks, which had taken centuries to build, had been reduced to rubble. The loss was not just physical, it was cultural and emotional. The people of Messina were grieving for their city's past as they worked toward its future. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the earthquake also brought about important changes in Italy's approach to disaster preparedness and urban planning. In the years following the disaster, the country began to implement new laws and building codes that would better withstand future earthquakes. The lessons learned from the Messina earthquake would shape Italy's response to natural disasters for generations to come. The recovery effort also highlighted the importance of community support. In the face of overwhelming adversity, the people of Messina came together, relying on each other for help and strength. Many survivors who had lost their families and homes found solace in helping their fellow citizens rebuild. This spirit of cooperation and solidarity would become one of the defining features of Messina's recovery. In addition to physical reconstruction, there was a growing need for psychological support for the survivors. The trauma caused by the earthquake, the loss of loved ones, and the destruction of homes left many people struggling to cope with the emotional toll of the disaster. Mental health resources were scarce, and it would take time for many survivors to find a sense of normalcy. As the years passed and Messina slowly began to rise from the rubble, it became evident that the city's recovery would be a long-term process. While the physical rebuilding of homes and infrastructure took priority, the emotional and social recovery of the people was just as important. The disaster had left a deep scar on the city, and it would take generations to heal fully. However, the resilience and determination of the people of Messina ensured that the city would eventually recover and rebuild stronger than before. As we continue, we'll explore the long-term effects of the disaster on Messina's people and the city's transformation in the years following the tragedy. The earthquake of 1908, while a source of great loss, would ultimately be a turning point that reshaped the city in profound ways. The Messina earthquake of December 28, 1908 left a profound impact on the people of the city and the wider region of Sicily. The devastation was not just in the loss of lives and property, but also in the emotional and cultural toll it took on the survivors. As the years went by, the full extent of the disaster's effects on Messina and its people became clearer. The earthquake had altered the city's landscape, economy, and society in ways that would be felt for generations. One of the most significant long-term effects of the earthquake was its influence on urban planning and building regulations in Italy. Before the disaster, Italy had very few regulations in place to protect buildings from earthquakes. The collapse of entire neighborhoods during the earthquake highlighted the need for stricter building codes, particularly in earthquake-prone areas like Messina. In the aftermath, Italy made significant strides in earthquake engineering. New laws were introduced that required buildings to be designed with seismic activity in mind. These changes not only helped protect the people of Messina, but also set a precedent for earthquake-resistant construction across the country. The recovery and rebuilding efforts, although slow and arduous, brought about positive change in some areas. The Italian government and international organizations began working together to improve disaster preparedness, and in the following decades, Italy's approach to handling natural disasters became more structured. This led to the creation of better early warning systems and emergency response strategies. While these efforts came too late to save many lives in 1908, they undoubtedly saved countless others in future earthquakes, including the devastating L'Aquila earthquake of 2009. The lessons learned from Messina influenced how Italy and much of the world would approach natural disasters in the years to come. In addition to the physical and structural changes, the Messina earthquake had a profound psychological impact on the survivors. Many people who had lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods struggled to move forward. The trauma of the event was something that could not easily be rebuilt, and it lingered long after the rubble was cleared. Communities had to come together to help each other heal, and families had to cope with grief and loss on a scale that was unimaginable. Counseling and mental health services, while not as developed as they are today, became an essential part of the recovery process. The emotional scars left by the earthquake would take decades to heal fully, and for many, the memories of that fateful day would never be erased. For the city itself, the road to recovery was long. Despite the immense destruction, Messina began to rebuild not just its physical structures, but its identity. The historic center, which had been reduced to rubble, was slowly reconstructed and new buildings were erected with more modern and earthquake-resistant designs. In the years following the earthquake, Messina also saw new industries and economic opportunities emerge as the city adapted to its new reality. While the scars of the past remained, Messina began to find its place once again on the map of Sicily and Italy. The story of Messina's recovery and transformation is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The city, though scarred, rose from the ashes, much like its people. While the earthquake was a tragedy of immense proportions, it also served as a catalyst for change in how cities and nations prepare for natural disasters. The importance of preparedness, resilient infrastructure, and community support in times of crisis became clear and the world took notice. The Messina earthquake of 1908 will always be remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. But beyond the tragedy and loss, it is a reminder of the strength and resilience of the people who lived through it. Their determination to rebuild, recover, and emerge stronger is an inspiring story for future generations. As we reflect on the legacy of the Messina earthquake, we are reminded that natural disasters, while often devastating, can also lead to progress and change. The lessons learned from Messina shaped Italy's approach to disaster response and preparedness, and they continue to guide efforts around the world today. The memory of Messina lives on, not just in the physical landscape, but in the spirit of the people who rebuilt their city and their lives from the ground up. With this final chapter, we conclude our exploration of the Messina earthquake, a tragedy that altered a city, a nation, and the course of history. We honor the lives lost, the survivors who endured unimaginable hardship, and the lasting impact this earthquake had on disaster preparedness worldwide. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. The 2010 Chile earthquake was one of the most powerful earthquakes in recent history. It occurred off the coast of central Chile on Saturday, February 27th, 2010 at 3:34 in the morning local time. The earthquake had a magnitude of 8.8 and shook the region for about 3 minutes. It was felt across 6 Chilean regions, from Valparaiso in the north to Araucanía in the south, affecting nearly 80% of the country's population. This earthquake was the largest hit Chile since the devastating 19 Valdivia earthquake, which remains the most powerful earthquake ever recorded. As with previous quakes, this disaster left a lasting mark on the country's landscape and its people. The epicenter of the earthquake was located off the coast of Pelujehue, a small town in the Mall region. The earthquake was also felt as far away as Buenos Aires, Argentina, and even in parts of southern Peru. Chile's capital, Santiago, experienced intense shaking as well, though the worst damage occurred closer to the epicenter, particularly in the city of Concepcion. This earthquake, along with the resulting tsunami, had far-reaching consequences not only for Chile but also for distant locations like California and Japan. Warnings were issued across 53 countries in preparation for the tsunami's arrival. Chile is situated on the boundary between two tectonic plates, the Nazca and South American plates, making it particularly vulnerable to these types of natural disasters. The earthquake that struck Chile on February 27, 2010, formed along the converging boundary of the Nazca and South American tectonic plates. These plates have been moving toward each other for millions of years, creating what is known as a subduction zone. In this case, the Nazca plate is slowly being pushed underneath the South American plate at a rate of about 80 millimeters per year. Over time, pressure builds up along this fault line until it is released in the form of a massive earthquake. The 2010 Chile earthquake was the result of many years of accumulated stress between these two plates, finally releasing in a sudden and violent event. Before the earthquake, Chile had experienced several smaller tremors, but there was no clear indication that a major quake was imminent. Preparations for earthquakes in Chile were already part of life, as the country sits on one of the most active seismic zones in the world. People were accustomed to earthquake drills and preparedness measures. However, nothing could fully prepare them for the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. On the night of the earthquake, people in the affected areas were asleep when the ground began to shake violently. Buildings swayed, roads cracked, and the sound of crumbling structures filled the air as the earthquake continued for nearly 3 minutes, followed by strong aftershocks. As the earthquake struck, it unleashed unimaginable destruction across central Chile. The hardest hit areas included the cities of Concepcion, Arauco, and Coronel, which experienced the strongest shaking. In these areas, buildings collapsed, roads were destroyed, and entire communities were cut off from outside help. The capital city, Santiago, also suffered significant damage, though it was less severe than in other regions. The intense shaking caused massive blackouts, leaving 93% of the Chilean population without power. Communication lines were disrupted, making it difficult for people to contact loved ones or get emergency assistance. The earthquake also triggered a tsunami that devastated coastal towns, including the port city of Talcahuano. Waves crashed onto the shores, sweeping away homes, boats, and vehicles. The tsunami warnings issued across the Pacific helped prevent further loss of life, but some areas were caught off guard. Chilean officials later estimated that the combination of the earthquake and tsunami had left over 500 people dead, 25 missing, and countless others injured. The total economic losses were staggering, with estimates ranging between $15 and $30 billion. Coastal communities were particularly vulnerable, and their recovery would take years. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, the destruction was overwhelming. Entire towns lay in ruins, and many people were left homeless. Roughly 9% of the population in the affected areas lost their homes, and for days, thousands of people slept outside, afraid to return to their damaged buildings due to the threat of aftershocks. The government declared a state of catastrophe, and President Michelle Bachelet deployed military troops to restore order and assist in the rescue and relief efforts. Emergency services scrambled to provide aid to the injured and stranded, while volunteers and international organizations joined in the recovery efforts. The earthquake had a profound impact on Chile's natural environment. Coastal regions experienced significant changes, with some areas uplifted by up to 3 meters. These shifts caused new land masses to emerge, altering the local landscape permanently. The powerful earthquake also shifted entire cities. For example, Santiago moved nearly 28 centimeters to the west, while the city of Concepcion shifted over 3 meters. In addition to the devastation of buildings and infrastructure, the earthquake caused massive damage to nature, displacing wildlife and destroying ecosystems along the coast. The 2010 Chile earthquake had a lasting impact on the country and the world. It was one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, and its effects were felt far beyond Chile's borders. The disaster highlighted the importance of preparedness in earthquake-prone regions, and Chile's response to the earthquake demonstrated the resilience of its people. Although the recovery process was long and difficult, the country eventually rebuilt much of what was lost, and lessons were learned that would help improve future responses to similar disasters. In the years since the earthquake, Chile has continued to strengthen its infrastructure and emergency systems, ensuring that it is better prepared for the next major seismic event. The 2010 earthquake served as a reminder of the country's vulnerability to natural disasters, but also its capacity for recovery. For the families who lost loved ones, the earthquake remains a tragic memory, while for others it stands as a testament to the strength and unity that emerged in the face of one of the most powerful earthquakes in modern history. On October 8, 2005, a disastrous earthquake struck the Kashmir region, which is administered by Pakistan. The quake primarily affected areas in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan and nearby parts of India and Afghanistan. It occurred at 8:50 in the morning, just as many people were starting their day. The earthquake measured 7.6 in magnitude, making it one of the most powerful earthquakes in the region's history. The epicenter was located near the city of Muzaffarabad, which is the capital of Azad Jammu and Kashmir. This region lies at the collision point of the Eurasian and Indian tectonic plates, which creates unstable geological activity. The earthquake's severity was heightened by poor construction in the affected areas. The combination of these factors led to an overwhelming impact, causing the loss of tens of thousands of lives and leaving millions displaced. Prior to the earthquake, the Kashmir region had experienced numerous seismic events, but none had prepared the population for the scale of this disaster. The day of the earthquake was a typical Saturday, and many students were at school, making the tragedy even more devastating. Little did the people know that their lives would change in an instant, as the ground shook violently, marking the beginning of one of the deadliest earthquakes in South Asia's history. The earthquake that struck on October 8, 2005, was a result of complex geological processes. The Kashmir region lies at the junction of the Eurasian and Indian tectonic plates. This collision has created immense pressure over time, leading to unstable seismic conditions in the area. As the plates moved, stress built up along faults in the Earth's crust. On the morning of the earthquake at 8:50 in the morning, this pressure finally released. The earthquake originated about 12 miles northeast of Muzaffarabad. Within moments, the ground shook violently, registering a moment magnitude of 7.6. This sudden release of energy caused severe upthrust, impacting not just the surface, but also the underlying geological structures. In the days leading up to the quake, the region experienced some minor tremors, which are often common before a major seismic event. However, these tremors did not indicate the scale of destruction that was about to occur. When the earthquake hit, it was felt far beyond the epicenter, with reports of shaking reaching as far as Afghanistan and northern India. The devastation that followed would leave lasting scars on the landscape and the people of the region. As the first day of the disaster unfolded, rescue workers faced a challenging situation. Many roads were blocked due to landslides triggered by the quake, making it difficult to reach those in need. The harsh terrain and sudden weather changes added to the urgency of the relief efforts, as the approaching winter threatened to complicate rescue operations further. The stage was set for a humanitarian crisis that would demand immediate action from both local and international communities. As the sun rose on October 9, 2005, the full extent of the devastation began to reveal itself. The earthquake struck with a force that shattered lives and landscapes. Buildings crumbled like sandcastles, and entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath debris. Muzaffarabad, the capital of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, was among the hardest hit, with many structures collapsing and leaving residents trapped under the rubble. Throughout the day, panic and confusion reigned as survivors tried to make sense of what had happened. Many people were caught off guard, especially since it was a Saturday, a day when schools were filled with students. Tragically, many school buildings fell, burying hundreds of children. Reports emerged from Messina district, where entire classes were lost as buildings collapsed, killing 350 students in one location alone. Emergency responders faced overwhelming challenges. The aftermath of the quake triggered numerous aftershocks, some strong enough to cause additional damage and hinder rescue efforts. By the end of the first week, more than 900 aftershocks had been recorded, further destabilizing the region and complicating the already dire situation. As relief efforts ramped up, the lack of infrastructure became painfully evident. Roads were blocked and communication systems were down, making it nearly impossible for aid workers to reach affected areas. Hospitals were overwhelmed with injured individuals, many of whom required immediate medical attention. The death toll began to rise rapidly as rescuers struggled to access remote villages that had been cut off by landslides. The shockwaves of the earthquake were felt not only in the physical destruction, but also in the emotional turmoil it unleashed. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, while communities banded together to support each other amidst the chaos. The first days following this earthquake set the stage for a humanitarian crisis that would demand a coordinated response from local and international organizations alike. The urgent need for shelter, food, and medical care became a focal point as the days stretched on, and hope began to fade for many. In the wake of the devastating earthquake, the landscape of northern Pakistan was forever altered. The destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. Entire ecosystems were impacted as well. Landslides swept through the mountains, burying roads and blocking rivers, which created new hazards for communities still reeling from the initial quake. In many areas, natural habitats were disrupted, leaving wildlife displaced and vulnerable. The humanitarian crisis deepened as millions found themselves without shelter. As winter approached, the harsh weather conditions posed an additional threat. Many survivors were forced to live in makeshift camps, struggling against the cold and inadequate supplies. The estimated 4 million people rendered homeless faced a bleak reality, with little hope for immediate relief. Basic needs, like food, clean water, and medical assistance became increasingly urgent as weeks turned into months. In addition to the physical destruction, the earthquake had a profound emotional and psychological impact on the survivors. Families lost loved ones, and entire communities were shattered. Grief and trauma spread through the region as individuals coped with the loss and destruction around them. The psychological scars ran deep, complicating recovery efforts. As international aid began to flow into the region, efforts focused on rebuilding not just the physical structures, but also the lives of those affected. The scale of the disaster necessitated a coordinated response from governments, NGOs, and local organizations, all working together to provide assistance. However, the task was monumental, and the effects of the earthquake would be felt for years to come. Efforts to restore the natural environment also began, but the challenges remained significant. The damaged landscapes required careful rehabilitation, and communities faced the daunting task of rebuilding their homes and infrastructure while coping with the scars left by the earthquake. The resilience of the people in the affected areas shone through as they came together to support one another, but the road to recovery was long and fraught with obstacles. On the whole, the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005 stands as a grim reminder of nature's power and the profound impact it can have on human lives. The event reshaped the landscape of the affected regions and left scars that will last for generations. The death toll exceeded 80,000, with many more injured and millions displaced, showcasing the sheer scale of this tragedy. The impact was not only physical. Families lost loved ones, and entire communities were torn apart. In the aftermath, the response from both local and international communities highlighted the importance of solidarity in times of crisis. Relief efforts poured in from around the world, with billions of dollars raised to aid recovery and rebuilding. Humanitarian organizations and governments worked tirelessly to provide food, shelter, and medical care to those in desperate need. However, despite the immense outpouring of support, the challenges of rebuilding were immense. Many areas faced ongoing struggles with accessibility due to damaged infrastructure and harsh winter conditions, making it difficult to reach those who needed help the most. The experiences of survivors served as powerful testimonies to resilience, illustrating the strength of the human spirit in the face of disaster. Ultimately, the 2005 earthquake was not just a natural disaster, it was a catalyst for change. It exposed vulnerabilities in building practices and emergency preparedness in the region. As a result, many lessons were learned that led to better construction standards and improved disaster response strategies in Pakistan and beyond. The earthquake's legacy endures as a call to remember the importance of being prepared for future natural disasters, as well as the need for compassion and support in rebuilding lives and communities. In the early 20th century, San Francisco was a city in the throes of rapid expansion, a bustling hub of innovation and ambition on the western edge of the United States. Located on a narrow peninsula bordered by the Pacific Ocean and San Francisco Bay, the city's scenic views and booming economy made it one of the most desirable places to live and work. Its population was growing rapidly, and so were the skyscrapers, streetcar lines, and intricate neighborhoods that sprawled through the city's famously hilly landscape. San Francisco was coming into its own as a modern metropolis, establishing itself as a key gateway for trade and immigration. But as the city evolved, so did its risks. San Francisco was not only a marvel of urban growth, but also uniquely vulnerable to natural disasters due to its location along the San Andreas Fault. This geological fault line, which runs almost the entire length of California, marks a boundary where the Pacific and North American tectonic plates meet. In many ways, the city's very existence on this fault line was a ticking clock for disaster, one that only a few experts truly understood or worried about at the time. Despite these hidden risks, the city's expansion was largely unregulated. Construction was happening at breakneck speed, but building standards and safety regulations were lacking. With little oversight, contractors often cut corners, opting for cheaper, less durable materials. The city's infrastructure was also relatively fragile. San Francisco's water supply system, for instance, was outdated and poorly equipped for a growing city, let alone a major disaster. In fact, San Francisco had already experienced smaller earthquakes in the past, but these minor tremors were largely ignored or forgotten in the enthusiasm of the city's golden era. Throughout the years leading up to the quake, there were occasional reminders of the city's vulnerability. Some geologists and city planners had raised concerns about the need for better earthquake preparedness. Still, few believed that such a disaster could hit in their lifetimes, and even fewer had ever considered the potential scale of devastation that could unfold. As San Francisco continued to grow, the booming neighborhoods and thriving downtown districts became ever more crowded. The lack of formal building codes meant that many structures were vulnerable to even moderate earthquakes, let alone the powerful shockwave waiting beneath the Earth's surface. In residential areas, buildings were tightly packed, and construction materials varied in quality, creating the perfect conditions for fire to spread should an accident occur. What no one realized, though, was that the city was on the brink of one of the most devastating urban disasters in American history. In the pre-dawn hours of April 18, 1906, San Francisco lay quiet under a still dark sky. At precisely 5:12 in the morning, this calm was shattered as a powerful earthquake struck the city, radiating shockwaves across the region with a force that no one had anticipated. This wasn't a minor tremor, but a colossal quake that would measure an estimated magnitude of 7.9, shaking the ground so violently that entire buildings shifted and cracked within seconds. People were jolted awake by the tremors, some thrown from their beds, while others scrambled to escape from their crumbling homes. The quake's epicenter lay offshore, just 2 miles west of San Francisco, along the infamous San Andreas Fault. The seismic waves radiated quickly, creating destruction not only within San Francisco, but throughout the surrounding areas, including coastal towns and nearby cities like Santa Rosa and San Jose. The quake's intensity was so strong that it was felt as far north as Oregon and as far south as Los Angeles. The first moments were sheer chaos as buildings, especially those constructed without solid foundations or quality materials, began to collapse around the city. Entire neighborhoods crumbled, and within seconds, thousands of people were trapped or injured as walls buckled and roofs fell. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but the destruction it left was astonishing. The city's famous brick buildings and ornate Victorian homes, many of which were built without structural reinforcement, proved particularly vulnerable, collapsing in heaps or leaning at precarious angles. For many who survived the initial quake, the nightmare was only beginning. Gas lines ruptured throughout the city, igniting fires that would soon turn out to be as catastrophic as the earthquake itself. While the earth had quieted, the sounds of destruction persisted, with the snapping of power lines, the crashing of broken glass, and the cries of frightened residents filling the air. The city's infrastructure had also taken a heavy blow. Major streets were buckled and torn open, with deep cracks that made movement nearly impossible in some areas. The cable car tracks that connected neighborhoods across the city were ripped from the ground, and the central water mains were badly damaged. This loss of water pressure would soon prove disastrous, as firefighters scrambled to combat the flames now erupting across the city. San Francisco's citizens were in a state of shock, and their first instinct was to flee to any open space they could find. Many people rushed to parks like Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, seeking refuge from the collapsing buildings and the fires spreading through the city. At the same time, the emergency response teams and firefighters faced an unprecedented challenge, with limited resources, broken communication lines, and no access to water in several districts. The scale of the quake's destruction was unlike anything San Francisco had ever faced, and it would take days to grasp the full extent of the damage. But as the fires continued to grow, the city's residents and officials realized that the earthquake itself had only been the beginning of a much larger catastrophe, and in the days following the earthquake, San Francisco became a city transformed. Fires raged across the city for nearly 3 days, consuming entire neighborhoods and leaving blocks upon blocks of once bustling streets in smoldering ruin. By the time the flames finally died down, an estimated 500 city blocks had been reduced to ash. over 28,000 buildings were completely destroyed, including landmark structures, homes, and businesses that define the city's identity. The famous City Hall, an architectural marvel completed just a few years before, was left as a mere shell, reduced to rubble by the quake and fire alike. For the tens of thousands left homeless, the situation was dire. Nearly half of San Francisco's population of about 400,000 people were displaced. Makeshift camps sprang up in public parks like Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and even along the beaches. The U.S. Army, stationed at the Presidio, took immediate action, setting up tents, distributing food, and providing medical care to those in need. Across the city, citizens formed small relief groups, banding together to share what little resources they had and helping each other rebuild what was left. The destruction of infrastructure was catastrophic. Roads, railways, and telegraph lines that connected San Francisco to the outside world were severed, making communication and supply delivery difficult. Relief efforts faced major delays as supplies struggled to make their way through damaged routes. Yet within days, aid from nearby cities, and eventually from across the country, poured in to help the city recover. The spirit of resilience among San Francisco's residents shone brightly as people gathered to clear debris, rescue survivors, and rebuild their lives. The events of April 19th revealed serious weaknesses in San Francisco's city planning and infrastructure. The fires, which accounted for nearly 80% of the destruction, exposed the inadequacies in the city's water system and the lack of fire-resistant building materials. Officials and city planners took these lessons seriously. In the years that followed, new building codes were enforced, focusing on structural integrity and fire resistance, ensuring that future buildings could better withstand such catastrophes. Additionally, new water systems and hydrants were installed across the city to allow for rapid fire suppression, even in the event of a severe earthquake. The impact of the disaster extended far beyond the physical rebuilding of San Francisco. The event prompted nationwide conversations about earthquake preparedness and safety regulations. Other cities built along fault lines, particularly those on the West Coast, began to rethink their own construction practices and emergency plans, recognizing that a similar disaster could strike them as well. This earthquake led to advancements in seismic research, eventually laying the groundwork for what would become modern earthquake engineering and safety standards. As San Francisco slowly rose from the ashes, it emerged as a symbol of resilience and rebirth. While much of its historic architecture had been lost, the rebuilding efforts transformed it into a stronger, safer city. By 1915, less than a decade later, the city was ready to host the Panama Pacific International Exposition, showcasing its recovery and the new San Francisco to the world. The scars left by the earthquake and fires served as a reminder of the city's vulnerability, but also of its unbreakable spirit. Today, the legacy of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake lives on, both in the city's architecture and in the safety protocols it inspired. It was a defining moment that reshaped San Francisco, preparing it to face future challenges, while honoring the resilience of those who endured one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history.